Wednesday, where we're building some worlds. I'm sharing some ideas on how to better build a world, how to create a world for your novel or game or what have you. Thank you for joining me. New camera angle this time, trying out that so I'm not looking over here the entire time, which isn't as helpful, I think. So let's quick review our settings. Last time we talked about factions, after we delved into deities and sort of fleshed those out a bit more. And we'll talk a bit about our settings. The first is our Verdant Bronze Age, a world with very little technology, plentiful food, a lot of wilderness and a lot of foliage. People are grabbing fruit off of trees and things like that, living in caravans, going around from sort of farm area to farm area. Magic is sort of hedge magic, very small, controlled, nothing really flashy or crazy. And casting that spell taxes the mind. So as opposed to the typical thing where you're physically exhausted, you're more mentally exhausted after casting a spell. Area with a lot of private private marks on personal property, so to speak. Again, migrant people, and then deities are there's a variety of deities, and with more or less one fundamental religion, with these various gods representing a nuclear family which live in their own caravan. And then we have, see, as I recall, there are world-ending powers on the trail of the gods, with these priests, a lot of shrines set up in specific places in the world to honor major religious areas, places where the gods have favored the world, natural springs, for example, particularly verdant areas. And then also there are some priests who go along with the caravans. Most do. We have this sort of fatalistic society because there's all of this, death and rebirth in society. It tends to create a fatalistic society, this idea that things are just always changing, and so it doesn't really matter that much what one person does as long as they're part of the overall pattern. And we identified some caravans. You're going to have obviously factions in each caravan, some rangers out in the wilderness who are kind of scouting and exploring areas. Each trade will have its own specialist sort of guild. Of course, the priesthood, as well as we had some idea of deep sea fishing, that the deep sea is so dangerous that there's a kind of subculture around that. Our other setting is our more technological one, the communist ranches, we call them. So we have iron, we have steel, gunpowder is arriving in armies. It is a world of one large landmass. I'm figuring sort of Australia maybe scale, maybe smaller than that. And then a bunch of little islands around it. And the main island has a lot of ore on it, and it's mined very heavily, while people generally live on the islands surrounding it in their own little countries. Communal property is normal. People live on these ranches where they take care of large numbers of herd animals, which are then eaten, butchered. And so people sort of live and grow up in these very communal environments of several dozen people. Then when you reach adolescence, you then, I think we said you go fishing, both literally and figuratively, where you take a fishing pole and go from community to community sort of looking for a spouse. And fishing to pay your way, if you will. Magic is very weird in this. I love it. You have magic has to be channeled through a magical creature, which becomes your ally and your familiar, but it's very dangerous and very hard to control. And the more magic you funnel through, the higher the chance that your familiar turns evil, basically. So we have these sort of large dude ranches as settlements, trade guilds, gods. We have this idea that each god represents a profession, and they all live on this sort of heavenly ranch. And it's a little more vague. There's less a sense of a story, a structure in terms of how the gods. I think in the other setting, there's a story of how the godly father and mother met and how they had their first child, and a story about the children growing up, things like that. And these gods are a little more impersonal. They're a little bit more meant as representations of various moral codes and such. And as such, it's less complicated. It is less complicated because you can have a variety of different characters. You're going to have different gods interacting with each other in different times in these stories. It's not they're kind of living eternally here as these roles. They're not kind of having a family grow up, because you have that much more agricultural world of things changing. Not things don't change on a farm, but it's a little more static. So we have gods of magic, etc., and so forth. And then we have the idea that priests are a little more separate from people. They have their own places of worship. They're probably a little bit more itinerant as well. They can go from where a priest may kind of blow in to a ranch and set up his or her own sort of place of worship there and provide things. Some settlements have multiple clerics, and they're used particularly over birth, marriage, and death ceremonies. Pretty normal. So that's what we have so far, kind of a high level. So let's go back to our principles. We've been developing some factions and things. We haven't gone into much detail about those factions, but that's okay. A lot of those details about those factions will come out in regard to your specific story, your specific game. Whatever you're trying to do with this world will suggest the factions that you want in that world. And then you can go in and dive into those details of who leads them, what their resources are, etc. At that kind of high level, you don't need to nail those down. So we might, as we get more ideas, and especially if and when we decide to implement something with these settings, we may do that. But for now that we have an idea of sort of the main sorts of factions we'll have in these worlds, we can move on to other things. I want to talk about two things this week: the role of children in a society, as well as what taboos a society does or does not have. And these are not necessarily related, but I think they're both things interesting and worth talking about. So children, people often don't think about children in a society, but you're going to have a positive birth rate, which means you're going to have kids. And particularly in pre-industrial societies, or really in pre-technological societies, you tend to need a very high birth rate because of the rate of disease. Now, some of this has been a little overemphasized, and some people think that every family had 12 kids in, say, the Middle Ages, and then 98% of them would die before they reached like the age of 18. That's overstating things. There certainly were large families back then, but then there are large families today. The birth rate was generally high, but not that absurdly high. And granted, there was a very high infant mortality rate, but you don't have to expect that there are huge numbers of children. That said, because so many settings kind of assume or never really talk about children, like children never show up, never appear in the world, I think it's worth delving a little bit into the role of children in society and what happens as a result of that and what children are doing. So let's talk about that. So I want to actually come back up here. We're going to insert this up here a little early. Well, no, we've been doing this in order, so we'll do it in order. So we're going to talk about children. And there are a few things I think that are worth talking about here. One is how many children does an average family have? Question mark. Again, this is important. And obviously this differs based on mortality rate. But what you're trying to think about here is this a world where that favors large families or that favors small families? And this will also possibly change from region to region and from in different strata of society. Contrary to popular belief, noble families tended to have more children than non-noble families in the Middle Ages, in at least the European Middle Ages, because the noble family had to have a successor. Somebody needed to take on these huge responsibilities, in contrast to a peasant family where you needed somebody, but it was gonna stay in the family some way or another. Yeah, in a sense, possessions could be a liability to the poor or the less well off, because how do you disperse that? If you have 3 kids and 1 house, what happens? So, you want to think about kind of what is the ideal family size, if you will, and we'll also say how many family have, in particular, what types of people favor more or fewer children, right? So we're thinking about, do peasant families tend to be big or small? But it's kind of an obvious thing. You also want to think about how much or what work do children do? In our society, children do basically no work. That has certainly not been true in the past. Although, again, this has been, I think, pushed a little bit too far in some cases. People assumed that, you had 3-year-olds working the fields 12 hours a day back in the day, and that's not quite true. But kids would have chores. They would have work-like responsibilities the older they got, and more of those the older they got. Sorry. So you want to think about what work is appropriate for children in this society, what is or isn't dangerous. In an industrial society where you need a lot of people involved, you're generally going to have child labor. And that might be, not terrible child labor. It really depends on the society and the environment and what is or isn't available. It also depends on the circumstances of a particular community. So, for example, if you have a mining community where everybody basically works the mines, it makes sense for relatively young people to be working in that mine, right? You're not going to tell a kid to wait until they're 18 to start working the mine. You're going to say, okay, you're 17, sure, 16, sure. So that's certainly a factor there. Whereas in other parts of the world, that there may not be the same kind of economic pressures on youth. And so examples can be, weeding, shepherding, household chores. I think of good examples in other environments. I think we can stop there. Those are all things that an 8-year-old can do to different extents. And obviously you'll also have are any of these gendered? And by that I mean, in medieval European society, generally, a boy wouldn't be taught how to knit, and a girl, she'd probably be able to do much of the things. You're not going to see a girl being a shepherd as much, although it certainly would happen. But that idea, you're going to have some things that are more generally done by boys than by girls, vice versa, and we're going to work to define those things. And if any of those are changing over time. Industrialization often leads to dramatic changes in gender expectations around work and children. Then major life changes. So, as a child, you transition from child to adult. And there are often several different phases in that. So, but there's not necessarily just one, right? So, for example, able to be apprenticed, able to work a full-time job. We'll just lay a few out of here and then go into them. Adolescents, able to marry, able to vote, able to fight in a war, able to run for office. Right, these are all things that might come into effect at different times in people's lives. You may be able to marry earlier than you're able to run for office. Some societies may say you have to be, so for example, in our society, you have to be a certain age to run for president. The age to marry changes in different times. There can also be, and I put in adolescence there because some societies have very different views on when adolescence happens versus when marriage happens. You may be eligible to marry as soon as you hit adolescence, or you may not. In our society, those are very different. For example, in a lot of medieval European societies, physical relationships between unmarried people in the country was quite common before marriage. Indeed, that was often a way for adolescents to get an idea of if they were compatible, so to speak. I think we mentioned this before, but sometimes, or quite rather often, a girl would marry the boy who impregnated her, because that sort of proves that they are fertile. So that can be very different depending on your society. And that, of course, that may be frowned on as well, as it was quite frowned on by a lot of people, especially the clergy back in the day. So, what does adolescence mean in the society? Is it this big changeover? Adolescence might mean that is a time when you are able to be apprenticed or able to work a full-time job or whatever. So all these things can be interrelated based on the society and how they think these things should be, and what is necessary, right? What are the pressures on that society? An agricultural setting, so like our first setting, where you're basically caravans going from fertile area to fertile area, children may not need to work quite as much. And since it's very mobile, there may be more work involved in tending the caravan, working as, say, a lookout, as opposed to working in a field, right? And I think that would be one of the things that young children would be expected to do in the caravan world, is serve as lookouts, and maybe do some basic, setting things up when the caravan stops. Maybe setting chalks out underneath the wheels and stuff like that. So these are all things to think about. So difference between apprenticing and a full-time job: you can apprentice as somebody at a job by just going there and working. Essentially, not even working there. You go there for a few hours a day, observe things. Your master will give you something to do that is very basic. If it's cobbling shoes, it might be cutting shoe shapes out of leather, where even if you don't get it exactly right, that's okay, because you need some extra space. So you have these simple tasks that you're tasked to do, and whoever you're apprenticing with assumes that you're not going to do it perfectly, right on, but you're learning. Think of like a chef is a great example of apprenticing, where if you want to be a great chef, you don't start in terms of the restaurant business by making meals. You start by chopping onions and chopping carrots and doing that for a while. And then you move up to doing more complex things, and you learn more complex dishes, more complex preparation methods, and then you can make the soup and move on and so forth and so on. Same thing with apprenticeship. You're starting with very simple things. They're not going to tax a child. And obviously, again, the child is not necessarily working 18 hours a day. Anyway, so those are some ideas around children. So those are some major life changes, and those may or may not be associated with major public events, right? These things may or may not be celebrated by people, right? In our society, we don't really celebrate the oncoming of puberty. Right? There's no puberty party in our world, even though we recognize it's a change, whereas that might be a thing in your society. But we've also tied a lot of things around that age of majority, that 18 to 21-year-old thing, where you're able to drink, marry, vote, etc. In fact, it's able to drink alcohol. In Mediterranean societies, for example, often children are given small amounts of alcohol over the course of their childhood to help them understand the taste and flavor and complexity of alcohol, so that when they reach the age when they can drink publicly, they know exactly how much alcohol will make them a little tipsy, right? So a parent's not getting them drunk; they're just saying, okay, try this much, try this much, try this much over the course of years. 1 year we'll try a sip, next year we'll try a little bit more. And then you eventually work up to that point where the child gets a little tipsy, and then you tell them, okay, now you know that is your limit. That is how far you can get, and from now on, whenever you drink, you're going to drink that much. And then again, this is a thing that happens at home before the legal drinking age, because the legal drinking age basically means when it is legal for you to purchase and drink alcohol on your own. The family can still kind of guide you in that. So that's kind of a complicated thing in terms of where we get at that point. Okay, so that's that. I think any other important things. So we should say, popular attitudes towards children. Innocent, workforce, etc. Right? So in the Victorian era, for example, children were seen as these innocent, not yet formed adults who needed to be able to enjoy their childhood and should be kind of protected and saran wrapped, for lack of a better term, which is not necessarily how it was seen in other parts of the world. Now, I should point out, there is this perception that before that there was no concept of childhood, and people thought that all children were essentially miniature adults, and that's not true either. And the children basically were not loved until the Victorian age. That's completely false. Children were seen as distinct from adults. They were very much loved. They were very much acknowledged for their distinct childrenness, if you will. But childhood was also seen as just a part of life, right? You might also have responsibilities before you turn 18. So, a great example of this, for example, might be Japan, where traditionally the age of majority, so the age of a marriage and the age when a samurai was considered or a boy could be considered a samurai was 15, and girls could be married at age 13, I believe it was, or maybe 13 or 14. And which is one of the reasons why so much Japanese pop culture is about high schoolers, 15-year-olds, because that's when you became an adult in traditional Japanese society, and it's when your adult responsibilities started becoming relevant to you, and so it's still considered this important period in your life. Now, obviously, it's not people in Japan are consciously evoking that, but still. And obviously, in the Industrial Revolution, children were very much seen as a potential workforce. It's one of the reasons why public schools were created, so as to stop all that competition from entering our workforce. From all those children were keeping adults from having regular jobs, so they had to be sequestered somewhere else. It wasn't really to educate them. It wasn't really to give them a good education. It was to keep them from competing with adults in work. Kind of weird. All right, so those are all thoughts around children. And again, the main thing here really is to start thinking about children and how they're used in your society and kind of what their roles are. So in our caravan environment, we're going to say children get jobs fairly early. A 6-year-old can serve as lookout. We'll say an 8-year-old can serve as lookout. Children are also easily distracted. And can put chocks underneath the wheels of a what do you call it? A caravan? What's an actual caravan cart? For those unfamiliar, a chock is a little, like a triangle of wood that you wedge. Essentially a wedge you put underneath a wheel to keep it in place. So if there's a triangle-shaped block underneath the front of a wheel and the back of a wheel, then it can't roll, right? So it's a way of keeping one of those in place. They get progressively more significant roles as they grow up, such as feeding horses, well, we'll say draft animals. No, I think it's draft, D-R-A-F-T, animals, and we'll say harvesting fruit. Right? Stuff that doesn't require a lot of labor or effort, but something that a kid can be pushed into doing without much concern. Otherwise, children are seen as, I think, very special. Childhood is a time of innocence, play, and experimentation to be cherished. So I think there is this kind of almost Victorian view of children as precious blank slates to be protected, possibly to an almost creepy degree. You know, I don't mean creepy and really creepy, but I think to excess. I think children are seen as these beautiful, innocent tabula rasas, and we mustn't get in the way of that. Kind of that hippy dippy thing. We'll let the children grow up however they want to, and meanwhile we'll get on about our businesses. So I think we'll do that. Children are, obviously they have stuff to do, but otherwise I think they're more or less left alone. Not a lot of fiddling with them. Certainly not seen as a potential workforce. They're just, like any kid in any house you're gonna have, or any home, you're gonna have your chores, your things you need to do, taking out the trash, kind of stuff. But I think there's gonna be somewhat less of that. So major life events will include the point at which a child can work. Is no longer a protected child in that sense. Then you get into, again, sort of adolescence, puberty, that idea of, fertility and what that means. And I think with an agricultural society, that will probably be more noted and paid attention to. So maybe there will be puberty rites in this culture. So, when a girl first gets her period, that kind of stuff might be something that's actually noted in society. Puberty. What else have we got here? So one of the big things you gotta deal with that, and we'll get to that later when we get to sex and sexuality, is the whole question of fertility, the question of, let's just be frank, the age at which a girl is fertile, first fertile, is not necessarily the best age at which she should get pregnant and carry a baby just physically. Like her body is not ideally capable of that. And this has been known, back into prehistory. Even though girls were often eligible for marriage at a young age and often might physically be married at a young age, it was pretty uncommon for them to actually have children until they reached their late teen years or even later, because everyone recognized just the pregnancy risk, the birth risks of a young teen girl. So that becomes an interesting issue of, again, in an agricultural society where, generally speaking, that's not true in plants. Wonder how we'll figure that out. So we got to, here's your question. How do we resolve the difference between sexual maturity and emotional maturity, if you will? well, we'll say sexual maturity and um, birth safety, probably the clearest way of putting that. So we have those. You have puberty. Voting in aspects of that is also going to be important. Fighting is not going to be that common, I don't think. So we'll say puberty and voting, politics. So there'll be a different age at which somebody can, a child is considered old enough to do that. I'm also thinking to that point, we're probably not going to have specific apprenticeship full-time work ages in this society. I think you just, at whatever age you're interested in, you can start following somebody else in a trade. Not that sense that, you're 12, it's time for you to get apprentice, that kind of thing. All right, so that's that. We may not get much chance to get to taboos. That's all right. Let's look back to our principles. Proper attitudes towards children. We covered that. What do they do? We covered a bit of that. How many children does an average family have? Let's say families often have parents tend to have large families. I like that idea, but I'm not sure about it. Again, the agricultural concept of you scatter your seed broadly, so to speak, makes sense. But then how do we, what kills them? Is it disease? It's not going to be war. It's not a very inherently warlike setting, necessarily. Maybe it's the wilderness. Maybe it's the environment. Large families. Most children do not survive due to illness and wild animals. Actually, we'll say not just wild animals, illness and the environment, dangerous plants and animals. So again, this is a place where if you venture too far from your normal route, you will encounter carnivorous plants, you'll encounter wild animals that are very dangerous. This is a sea of corruption from Nausicaa idea where the environment is trying to kill you, straight up. Okay. So you have that figured out. Children get jobs fairly early. All right, I like that. All right, so we move on to setting 2, our communist ranches. Let's think about that. And again, one of the ideas here is to take different tacks in each one. So one thing is that families tend to have, or parents tend to have smaller families, 3 children at most, which again implies a relatively stable society. We may have to figure out other ways of increasing the population. Children are put to work fairly, quite early. Feeding animals, milking animals, shepherding, etc. Lots of work on the ranch for kids, stuff that's not physically demanding. That's simple. That makes sense. What else do we have? Whoops. What do you have favor more of your children? And again, because we might have, So if you have relatively small families, what if clerics have a lot of kids? What if that is one of the typical things clerics do? What if clerics are all women and they're having kids a lot? Or it could be, women and men, and that's just a normal thing for clerics to have. But that would make a lot more sense in the other setting. So what if we did this? What if we split it around? What if we switched it around? So what if families in the other, or we could have clerics in the other world also have a lot of kids, be fruitful and multiply. But with these smaller ranch families, again, you're you're still going to have, and we're expecting a fair amount of war in this society, so you need a lot of kids. We have gunpowder, it's the Renaissance, so we have better medicine. How do we have kids without going into weird, creepy, we don't have cloning, presumably. We could have weird magic. I mean, we do have all these magical familiars, but they're not going to be creating humans, right? Unless they are. So it would make more sense, if you will, to have the clerics in this world having a lot of kids. I don't know. We'll do that. Clerics, by calling, have a lot of children. And so we'll have to, that might end up feeling a little weird to our view, because those clerics, do we have unmarried clerics who are then having children by various people in the community? Would that feel weird? Would that feel creepy? Having sex with married people, just so as to, to breed as much as possible. That feels weird and creepy. Maybe they only have children with each other. So yeah, clerics, by calling, have a lot of children with each other. Maybe one of those things where, clerics naturally, as they meet and as they get together, they, get together. And that is just considered a thing you do as a cleric. It's a way of honoring the gods, is to have children. And you might have, clerics who are basically husband and wife, who are committed to each other and only have children by each other. Maybe that's common, but it's not at all the only way. Yeah. Many clerics work as husband and wife teams, but it's also common for visiting clerics to keep each other producing children. We'll put it that way. Certainly open for abuse, certainly open for creepiness. But it creates an interesting setting where you have a lot of kids born from these clerics, and in these tight-knit communities, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for them, right? You're not necessarily being born into a village where everybody weaves cloth. Everybody on the ranch is doing ranch stuff, and so it's a more free society in that sense. Okay. All right, yeah, so we'll leave that as it is. Major life changes. And we have this very communal environment. Major life changes include, I don't think we're going to have puberty as one. Obviously, it is one, but I don't think it's going to be publicly celebrated. Again, you're probably not going to see apprenticing or working a full-time job necessarily. Well, can work. That's already a thing over there. So we don't have work, we don't have puberty, we don't have that. So marriageability, we've already talked about that. Running for office, drinking alcohol, that would be an interesting one. So we'll say, include, did we call it something? Adolescents, there we go. Fishing walkabout. The fishing walkabout upon adolescence. And the age at which a child can drink. Think about voting, being part of the what everyone how everyone can vote with a very communal environment. That's going to be important. Age of voting, the age at which child can drink. Yeah, having a say in the community is going to come early. I think pretty young children will be able to vote, relatively speaking. There may be some factor in that where maybe, when you're 12, you get like a half vote. Then when you're 18, you get a full vote, something like that. I like that. Age of voting. At 12, you get a half vote. At 18, you get a full vote. So adolescents get a say in things, but it's not as strong as those who have, a little bit less of those things going on. Hey, Ivy. Hey, Carmadillo. We're talking about the role of children in these societies. We're about to finish that up. And then popular attitudes towards children. Children are seen more as productive, but unskilled members of the ranch. Well, maybe potentially productive. And I don't intend by that the idea that they're just miniature adults, but that there's less of a sense of childhood as this magic age of innocence and play. You'll certainly play, you'll certainly do things. So we're just talking about the role of children and what to do. So let me do a quick review of that. Things to think about in terms of children. How many children does the average family have? Does that vary by class, by environment, particularly? What work is appropriate for children to do in this society? What are those chores that you'd expect a child to be able to do and not do? Some of those are rather surprising in some environments. A good example would be in Japan. You have geisha, who are entertainers. Then you have maiko, who are apprentice geisha, but they actually have jobs to do. So if a geisha is entertaining somebody, the maiko or maiko will come in and open the curtain and sit to one side and introduce the geisha, and is certainly there to watch, but also has a little bit of a role in the entertainment while the geisha is the star of the show, if you will. So very different, compared to say an apprentice in medieval Europe, where they are working their way up through various skills. The maiko is certainly doing that in Japan, but also has these little jobs as part of the proceedings. And then what are the major life changes? What differentiates child from adult? And so what might those be? Which of those might be celebrated in public ceremonies? And then how do people generally view children? Are they these innocent creatures that must be given also to playtime? Or are they more integrated as members of society? Do you see children, working the ranch, working the farm, stuff like that? So we've dug into those to an extent. I think we have a pretty good idea. Let me go back to the principles, attitudes. I think we've got a pretty good idea of that in here. We should also talk about. That's an important thing I forgot to mention. What do children wear? Children grow, and so if you have a society where generally folks don't have a lot of money, a lot of resources, it doesn't make sense to have to give your children lots of different changes of clothes that they're going to grow out of immediately. So you tend to have simpler clothing that children can grow into. So a dress for a girl is a great example of where you can have a dress for a young girl that as she grows up just becomes smaller on her, and she needs to be adjusted, but that can kind of grow with the child as opposed to a tracksuit. So those kinds of things are worth thinking about. We haven't really defined much about clothing in either of these societies. So I think But I think on a farm, you're going to have more specific clothing, right? You're going to have, you're going to need certain protective clothing when working with large animals, for example. You're going to need boots, stuff like that. So I think children tend to wear a lot of communal clothing that they grow out of and are passed on to younger children. This gets into aspects. This gets into early views on personal possession. The clothes that a child actually owns are rare and special, right? So in that society, we have a lot of those things that, personal possession is very important, and so clothing ties into that. As a kid, you don't have lots of full outfits in your closet. You are having some sort of basic underthings, and then throwing on these communal clothing for the jobs, the other stuff you have to do around the ranch, or whatever. That makes sense. So it might be sort of a life event. Your first piece of personal clothing. Once you're old enough for that to be worth it. And it also might be changing over time. A major event in many children's lives is their first piece of personal clothing. Okay, cool. I also want to talk about taboos. Kind of a weird topic. We'll probably come back to taboos. What is unacceptable to do in public but acceptable in private? What is unacceptable in any circumstance? What is frowned upon in public but won't cause legal problems? What is frowned upon in private? Right. And these are all things to think about. So unacceptable in public but acceptable in private. Good example, nudity. Right. Unacceptable in any circumstances. Personal violence. Good example. Or in certain societies, certain varieties of sexual activity were unacceptable in any circumstance, right? So those are taboos. And you also have just sort of, politeness taboos. You wouldn't walk up to somebody on the street and spit in their face. You wouldn't do that in private either, probably, But, there's nothing necessarily, evil about that. It's a taboo. Uniform dress considering turtlenecks, jogging pants, aviator shades, and sneakers. That's the Apple campus, I believe, you're describing there. Is that particular commune. So you have those things. Then you have just general behavior things that are acceptable or unacceptable in certain circumstances. So, going out in public while dirty is a thing that you would not do in regular society around here. And we're talking covered in grime and dirt and walking down a city street, generally considered a taboo. But if you're at home and you're out in the garden and so that happens. My mom famously was dealing with one of her horses out in the paddock, and it was rainy and muddy, and the horse knocked her over, and she fell face first in the mud. And this paddock had mud, probably a foot deep. And so she just went, and she came back up to the house just covered in mud. And that's that's kind of thing where, again, in your personal life that's going to happen. That's not something people are going to think badly about you. Let's see here. Frowned upon in public but won't cause legal problems. spitting, for example, in the street, right? In many environments, just in front of somebody especially would be considered very much frowned upon, but wouldn't actually necessarily cause any issues. And again, you'll have families that might spit at home, and that's just fine. Also frowned upon in private might be, what would be a good example? Well, passing gas is a great example of that. Something that people generally just don't do. Well, in fact, we'll just say in private. In private. Private means, amongst family and friends. Says, well, the double blink during conversation. I'm not familiar with that as a social concern. All right, so these are all things, and then circumstances. And then are there, or what is taboo in religious circumstances? What is taboo in front of children? What is taboo at work? And then, a good example of differences in taboos in different contexts is in the Dune series, where the characters have all come to a desert planet, very little water, and they meet the locals for this big conference, and the Duke is trying to court the locals of Fremen and get them to agree to something. And the representative of the Fremen finally agrees and then leans forward and spits on the table. And the Duke reacts in shock, and his advisor says, hey, no, that's a sign of respect. He is giving up his water to you, right? By spitting, that is sacrificing water that he can't get back. It would be very much a taboo in other cultures, but amongst a water scarce society, that makes sense. Oh, got you, Cumberdeal, just as a possible possible thing. I think that would be very hard to control. Not double blinking. Perhaps that is a sign of duplicity, a sign of being a liar. I like that a lot, actually. We're just going to put that in. Double blinking in a conversation is considered a sign of duplicity. That's cool. Good idea. So you have kind of thin taboos, or light taboos and heavy taboos. We have a lot of taboos around sexuality and children, quite understandably, and some of those don't make a lot of sense on the face of it, but the more you dig into it, the more you understand why those are there. And some taboos are, if you will, intentionally strong. Too strong than they need to be for every circumstance, but it kind of covers bases. So it ensures that something bad won't happen, because it is better to restrict a certain behavior, too much for the, occasional bad thing that will happen as a result of that taboo being broken. And a great example there would be, how we relate to, letting children see their parents enjoying each other physically. Children are often very confused by that, and they don't understand it. It looks like they're hurting each other. So it's generally better to be more discreet with that if possible, because for every kid who understands and doesn't have a problem with it, there will be a lot of kids who are confused and have problems with it as a result of seeing that. So it's just better to be discreet. That kind of thing to think about. But we're almost at time. So I think next week we will dig a bit more into taboos. We're probably not going to copy a lot of taboos from our society. We may copy a few. But the important thing here is to think about what taboos would exist in your society that would make your society distinct and memorable. And you want to avoid necessarily coming up with taboos just to come up with taboos. Now, by that I mean having a few just kind of random taboos, kind of like that Carmadillo's idea, is great. It adds some flavor. But you don't want to just say, okay, I need to just make up 5 taboos and insert them and be done. You want maybe 1 or 2 taboos that are just kind of there, and others that are tied into your setting, that are tied into the beliefs and themes of your people and what's going on in their society. So, for example, this caravan world that's very much tied to nature might be a little more open about sex and sexuality than another society. Maybe more appropriate to talk about those things than it would in other environments, especially when folks kind of living together like that. You may have a society, for example, where you don't talk about religion much, where that is considered sacred, and so something that you don't bring up in casual conversation because it is dishonoring to the gods. And that works into how people see the gods, how people deal with things. In fact, let's just put that in there. I'm liking that. Taboos. It is considered somewhat profane to bring up the gods in casual conversation. That is a holy topic to be reserved for meetings with priests or a separate conversation, right? So that might be a thing that colors your world. All right, that'll do it for this week and this hour of World Building Wednesday. We'll be back next week with fleshing out some more of these taboos, coming up with some ideas of things for our setting that might make sense for that. And after that, we will probably talk about clothing. I think it's going to be important for us to, in fact, let's go ahead and just throw that in there. So next thing we're going to talk about is clothing, how that relates to your world, what different kinds of clothing there are, the sort of practical advantages and disadvantages of those. When you have different views on clothing, and obviously nudity ties into that as well. What is considered nude? What is considered appropriately dressed? Not just things covered, but in some societies, you're not fully dressed unless you have a hat on, right? So lots of possibilities around there. We'll dig into so we'll flesh out more of taboos and then go into clothing, I think, next time, since it's already come up with kids in the other setting and what kind of clothing they wear. I think that'll make sense there. And then we will move on from there to other aspects of our society. Hope you found that useful. For those watching live, I'm just going to go off for a few moments and then come back for the workshop Wednesday. So just give me a moment to switch over the cameras and so forth. We'll go back. We will go black for a few minutes, and then we will be right back. See you then.